Hello, everyone. My name is Zaren Healey White, and I'm here with filmmaker Maria Finitzo to introduce her and chat about her 2020 film, The Dilemma of Desire, screening at this year's St. John's International Women's Film Festival. First, I'll let you know a bit about Maria. Maria Finitzo is a two-time Peabody Award-winning social issue documentary filmmaker. She's been producing and directing documentary films for network television, public broadcasting, cable TV, and the internet for more than 25 years. Her body of work has been honored by every major broadcast award granted to documentary films. Ms. Finitzo's films demonstrate a depth and breadth of knowledge and expertise, tackling a wide variety of subjects, including the controversial science of stem cell research, the command and control of nuclear weapons on an international level, and the complex psychology of adolescent girls. Her new feature-length documentary, The Dilemma of Desire, is an exploration of clitoris and the clash between gender politics and the imperatives of female sexual desire. Maria Finitzo's work focuses on four women who are shattering myths and lies about female sexual desire, bodies, and ultimately power. All right, I'll let you know a little bit about me. My name is Zaren Healey White. I'm a feminist, a writer, an artist, and former journalist. I currently work in communications and marketing. I completed a Master of Gender Studies degree with a focus on, among other things, feminist art, embodied art and performance, including autobiography, self-portraiture, performance art, and body art. I've also worked on several community feminist art shows here in St. John's, focusing on the art of women and all gender diverse folks, showcasing art that is feminist in its subject matter, and especially art that is feminist by the means of its creation, giving space to art and artists that have been historically marginalized and excluded. Hi, Maria. Thanks for joining me here for this In Conversation with chat about your film, The Dilemma of Desire.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
In the film, you feature many different people who've come to embrace and explore and demand sexual agency, pleasure, and power, and this notion of clitoris. And it's in so many different ways and parts of society. What led you to first start exploring this subject matter and decide to make this film?
So after I finished my last film, a film called In the Game, about gender and life opportunities based on race, class, and ethnicity, I was looking for another subject, the way we always do. And I read a book that explored the science of female sexual desire using women as subjects. And the author went around and spoke to scientists who were studying this topic all across the country and in Canada as well. And the upshot of the whole book was women have as robust a sex drive as men. They're simply told lies about it to reinforce patriarchal structures. And I remember when I got to the conclusion of the book, I remember thinking, well, that's great. You know, women have as robust a sex drive as men. Now, what are women supposed to do with that information when we really aren't free to behave however we want? Even at this point, this was 2012, I think. And so what was very interesting to me was looking, as a filmmaker, was looking at all of the things that got in the way of women having agency over their desire, whatever that desire was, and being able to express their desire in a way that felt right to them. And that's where the beginning of the film, that's where the film started, at that kind of question is what gets in the way.
Mm-hmm. I know for myself, a lot of my own experience of feminism has been that process of unlearning all those things that are socially enforced, years and decades of conditioning around what it's like to be socialized as a girl, as a woman. And part of that for me has definitely been learning to identify those sort of unseen structures like medicine, psychology, science, even our legal system and the courts of law, and realizing that they're not these neutral institutions that were put there, but they are inherently patriarchal. They've been cultivated by patriarchy. Some of your subjects, really spoke about how women are taught that they don't even own their own bodies. So if you don't own something, of course, why would you touch it? Why would you get to know it? Why would you feel like you can do anything with it? I guess tell me a bit more about some of these myths about the clitoris and women's pleasure that you came up against while researching this.
Well, so first of all, just start with the whole notion that the film starts with is The clitoris, the organ found on the body of every mammal-born female, and in human beings, its sole function is sexual pleasure, is left out of 3 out of 5 anatomy textbooks for college levels. So that is just left out. I mean, it might be put in a little external part, but the whole internal organ is left out. Imagine if that's what we did to the penis. That'd be absurd, right? Left out most of the anatomy of it. And so when you start there, right, which is that our bodies don't meet the bar for truth, then there's no way girls and women growing up can have knowledge of their bodies because they can't find it anywhere. And if they don't have that knowledge, then how are they supposed to understand their own sexuality, and then later on in life be able to tell their partners what feels good to them? And so it's not so much a myth about the clitoris as it is the lies about the clitoris. So we're all taught as femme identifying, as women, as girls growing up, that heteronormative sex intercourse is the way women reach an orgasm. Well, that's a lie. It's almost anatomically impossible for most women, and that's not where our pleasure lies. And so when you begin your life as a young woman, beginning to explore your sexuality, essentially you're beginning it with a lie. Mm-hmm. And so girls and women, when they do have sex, feel bad about themselves because there must be something wrong, because it's not like in the movies, and it's not like how I read in a book, and why is it all about the male pleasure and I'm not feeling anything? And so these are purposeful lies that we're taught. Mm-hmm. And we're taught in order, if you lie to somebody, it's the first way you can begin to control them. So all of these lies are told in pursuit of the control of women's bodies. And that's still going on today. And it's probably going on worse today than it did when I started this film.
Absolutely. It's like you said, not a myth, but a total systematic erasure for the purpose of control.
Complete erasure. Yeah.
It's quite incredible, really. I was really drawn to those experiences of your subjects. I felt like I really got to know them and their unique contexts and experiences. And it's quite an intimate thing to be a subject, to be disclosing in this sort of way. And just through the variety of subjects that you featured, I felt that I could really get a snapshot of how they grappled with their relationship to their body, pleasure, power in a pretty in-depth way. What's it like finding subjects for a film like this and building that trust in order to really unpack the experiences and beliefs of something like this that's so personal?
Well, finding subjects for a documentary is one of my favorite things to do when I begin a project. One is I get to meet all kinds of people, but two, I begin the exploration, and then I don't really know where I'm going to end up. And for this film, one of the first people I found, of course, was Sophia Wallace, the artist who created Clitoris, 100 Natural Laws. And I found her easily on the internet because her work is so amazing and it's so well documented. And then Lisa Diamond I also found through her scholarship. And then when I was starting to look for the other 4 kind of main experts, we called them, even though they're not experts, I felt it was really important to find everyday women who didn't easily speak about their sex lives and who didn't easily speak about their anatomy. They weren't studying it, right? They weren't artists making, bodies of work about it, but they were just women living their lives. And the way I found the 5 that are in the film is I sent out a notice to everybody I knew. And I said, please invite anyone who you think, femme identifying women, doesn't matter, to come to a meeting and I will talk to them about the project. So I had a meeting of about 45 women, diverse, gender diversity, ethnically diverse, age diversity, and I showed them a short clip of the film. And then we started talking. And the first thing one of the women in the room said, and none of us had ever met each other before, was, I so want to have this conversation. We never get an opportunity to talk about this. Mm-hmm. So what was really striking to me was how willing women were to be in a film like this, which was deeply personal, and then also share what are amazingly intimate details of their life. And so in the film, a lot of the interviews you see are the very first time that I'd ever met those women. And I really think it was a leap of faith for them to trust me, and I felt very honored by that. And of course, over the course of 2 years of filming, the trust built. But initially, there was such an openness on all of their parts to share with me what was going on in their lives. And I think because there is an urgency among women to be able to talk about what's going on in their lives, because we don't talk about women and sex. Women aren't allowed to talk about their genitals. They're not allowed to talk about their sexual experience unless it's horrible and bad. And they're not allowed to talk about their desire. And that's unfair. Men talk about sex all the time. Men talk about their genitals all the time. Yet it's even taboo for a woman to name their genitals. And so a lot of the women I met in the beginning of making this film said to me the same thing. I've never said the word clitoris.
Yeah.
So you begin to sort of understand what an incredibly successful campaign society has been mounting in order to shame women around their desire. And I really think that's why in making this film, women were so willing to step forward and participate. They're tired of the shame.
Yeah, that's interesting. You say campaign. It really is. It's naming those unseen structures, and by when we are silent, we continue to participate in that. We are enabling that campaign that continues to completely make it impossible for women to even name a word that's on their bodies, let alone talk openly.
The medical term for an organ on their body, clitoris, is a word that nobody wants to say. It's the medical term for it. It's like, do we have a problem with heart, lungs, pancreas, appendix? No. But the word that signifies a woman's sexual pleasure, the medical term, that's shameful for women to say. It's kind of I grew up in the 60s when everything changed, and it was all supposed women's liberation and all that. And I really was struck when I have two kids, and I was really struck when my daughter was growing up, because I noticed that things were not so great for her, right? Girls are encouraged to be sexual, but there are no guardrails now. And so when they are, they're kind of shamed for their behavior. And so I felt like we had regressed many years. I mean, I didn't feel like it's the 1950s, but I really felt like we'd lost all the gains we'd made in the early 1960s around the women's movement.
Yeah, just picking up on that and going back to a couple of things we've already talked about, it definitely seems that this, what I would call anti-sexist education and even feminist sex education, is still so urgently needed. We tend to think things have improved since 10 years ago or 20 years ago, but they haven't, not to the extent that they need to be. And this idea of cliteracy is still definitely not permeating into formal sex education. I guess, can you speak a bit about just the state of sex education, both in terms of what's happening in classrooms, but also what's happening at home?
Well, I think in terms of classrooms in the United States, I know that I think there are only 24 states actually teach sex education. And what are there, 50 states in the United States? And out of those 24, only 13 by law have to be accurate. So you can teach kids anything you want about sex in the United States, or you don't have to teach them anything at all. And so that's actually horrible. I know in other countries in Europe that have a much more enlightened view of sex education. I think Norway does, Denmark, Sweden. Kids grow up understanding their bodies in a much more healthy way. And so I think that what has to change in this country is this aversion to telling girls and women the truth about their anatomy and about their desire. And I think I sometimes say to myself, imagine if girls were taught about their bodies in a way that was not shameful to them and not made to feel like that was something horrible. Imagine how the world would change if we empowered girls with that knowledge, instead of feeling bad about their bodies, instead of feeling like sex was something they had to avoid because they could get pregnant or a disease, or just something that somebody was going to use their body for. Imagine if we actually empowered girls to think about their bodies in different ways. The world might change a great deal.
And it, like you said, it is definitely political. If it's up to different school boards in different states and different countries to decide by design what they want to include and what they want to exclude, it's clear that there is a level of obstruction there. It's a society upholding patriarchy, by design. And one thing I think a lot about is how patriarchy and male supremacy continues to gain something from obstructing women's understanding of their pleasure and power, which is such a a toxic concept, that in order for, that for women to make gains, or for anyone that's not a cisgender male to make gains towards having more rights, that it's actually going to take away from this other group. And that's so much of what everyone who's doing work on different parts of different feminisms is always fighting against, this idea that like me developing rights is not going to infringe on someone else's. Men's sexual supremacy operates in this way, in which women's pleasure and sexuality needs to be sidelined, as though it's going to infringe. So I guess, why is women's sexual autonomy still so challenged? Why is it so threatening?
Well, I think there's a lot of fear around sexually empowered women. And one of the men in my film he says, if you're the guy half-assing your way through your sexual encounter with a woman, if you're with a woman who has a great deal of knowledge about her body and her sexuality, that's deeply threatening, because she might not settle for you, right? And if you believe the words of Audre Lorde, she opens the film, she says, once a woman understands the true extent of the potential in her life, she won't settle for less. And I really think that's true. I think if women understood, if girls understood that their sexual pleasure resided in their own bodies in a way that was amazingly powerful, they would make different choices when they decided to become sexual. They might become sexual, but they might also say, well, if this is what's going to happen, then here's what's going to happen first. And so it would become an idea that if I'm going to share my body with you, I need to get something in return. Or maybe first, right? But now that entitlement to sexual pleasure is not taught to girls. And it's even, in some ways, women are punished for wanting it, right? Because if a woman feels she's entitled to sexual pleasure, then it's flipped around on its head and she's asking for it, right? And so sexual pleasure and sexual desire and the expression of that is one of the most intimate forms of it's one of the most intimate things we do as human beings. And that shouldn't be controlled or criminalized or criticized. And yet, as women, that's what happens to us all the time. And I think it's fundamentally a fear of women becoming powerful. I don't think women becoming powerful means men are not powerful. I just think it would mean that they have equal partners. And that's something we should all want.
Exactly. That's the thing, because this toxic masculinity is hurting all genders. It hurts men, it hurts women, it hurts.
Absolutely. It hurts everybody. And I think there are a lot of men out there, because I've heard from them, who thank me for making the film because they finally understand a woman's body. And I think they would love to be able to pleasure their partners. But, I think Sophia Wallace says it in the film. She says, if a woman doesn't know her own body, how's the man supposed to know it? Right? So it really works for both of them if both partners come together with a knowledge of their own bodies that they can then share with each other.
Absolutely. And continuing that, some of the subjects in the film, really expressed not knowing or even believing that they had a right to pleasure, that they had a right to good, equal, enjoyable sex. And that's such a roadblock there in that sort of discourse, let alone, pleasure that is centered on this unique embodied experience that they are capable of having. And there was a lot of disclosure, about shame and the belief that orgasm is just elusive rather than something that, they're entitled to pursue, that they're allowed to be actually actively pursuing. I was just wondering, do you think internalized misogyny kind of factors into this in the way that women value their own pleasure?
Oh, I think absolutely. I think there's, I talked to a lot of women before I chose the women who were in the film, and a lot of women have a lot of hate around their own bodies and a lot of shame around their own bodies, and that's taught. That's just doesn't happen. It's taught, and it's taught in the culture. It's taught in um, our pop culture. It's taught in our music. It's reinforced in religion. And it doesn't matter what religion, it's reinforced across the board in every religion. And so women grow up either thinking that they're unworthy and that their bodies are horrible and disgusting, because that's in some sense what happens. That's the way we're treated, right? I mean, so women are sort of, they have this power to arouse, right? And that somehow must be a shameful thing. Well, the power to arouse isn't shameful. The response, which is sometimes, you know, out of control, is what's the shameful parts. When women get raped, that's the shame, okay? Not women, that rests on men, okay? But the shame of something like rape, that falls on the woman. Well, she was raped. Well,
Yeah.
do you shame somebody if they get hit by a car? No, you arrest the driver, okay? Do you shame somebody if they get cancer? No, I mean, it's just, and it's absurd, right? That women are constantly victims, and that getting out of that, crawling out of that identity is very hard, because that's what's reinforced all the time. And that's a lot of misogyny. We live in a very misogynistic world right now. It's gotten worse since 2016, way worse. And I mean, that's one of the reasons why Hillary Clinton lost the presidency in the United States. And a lot of women voted against her. And we voted in a man who we are now living under the consequences of.
And it's patriarchy also gains so much from internalizing that misogyny in, again,
right. It's a way of controlling people. If you hate yourself, you can be controlled.
Yeah, so we're really enabling it by this sort of self-policing that we shouldn't blame ourselves. We should try to break free from it. But certainly, anyone who's a woman or feminized or gender diverse, anyone who's not the hegemonic cisgender male, we do internalize much of that. And it we become inadvertently complicit, I guess, in that oppression. I want to go back to the biologist that you featured, Dr. Stacy Dutton, saying the clitoris has one function, sexual satisfaction. And that really struck me in thinking about how it's no wonder that it's been systematically excluded, because that element is seen as superfluous. If women's pleasure and orgasm is not valued, of course the organ that enables that is not going to be valued. And this again shows how informed science is and has always been by male priorities, by men's pleasure and power. So I was glad to see, in the film, mentions of medical texts excluding the clitoris and the bringing in the sort of really harmful Freudian ideas of hysteria and all that sort of stuff as part of historicizing where you were approaching the topic in the last few years. But there's so much to sift through in terms of how to position how we've gotten to this cultural moment. How did you decide what to focus on in the long, long history of patriarchy?
Well, what I always try and do is I try and let the subjects in my film and what's going on in their lives and the conversations we have take me down a direction, right? So that's what's so great about being a filmmaker, is that I learned so much in the process of making the film. And so it's, for me, an exploration. And meeting Sophia Wallace and Lisa Diamond and T. Chang and Stacey Dutton and learning about their work, when I learned all about that, then I saw how it resonated in the lives of the 5 women I had chosen. And I knew that that's what was going on. And I was most interested in thinking about how the film, to me, is about power. And power is easily taken when the truth is replaced with a lie, right? So women who are not sexually empowered, women who don't have the knowledge of their own body, they can't access their own power either politically or personally. And so for me, this film is really about trying to engage not only women, but men, women, engage all human beings around the notion that people deserve to know the truth. As human beings, we deserve to know the truth about our anatomy and our physiology, and that shouldn't be withheld from anybody. And that if you don't know that truth, then it's very hard to access your own personal power. And for women and sex, you can't separate the way women are treated sexually from the way they're treated in the world. And so to me, this is really a film really grounded in Audre Lorde's scholarship, which is, women have within their bodies that lies in a deeply spiritual plane, this power called the erotic. Now, it's not sexual, all right? It's a life force. And that once women can access that power and are not afraid of it and stop listening to the way male culture turns it into pornography for their use, then they can start to access their power. And if you believe her words, and I certainly do, she feels that a woman so empowered can fight against racism and misogyny and all of the ills of the world. And I think she's right. And so denying women that knowledge is denying them access to power. And I think that has to change.
Definitely. I reread that, Audre Lorde's work in preparing for this. So I couldn't agree more. It resonated so much using her as sort of a frame into this topic. It really definitely resonated with me. One thing I wanted to ask you about is, I know in my own research, I've done some work on, patriarchy, toxic masculinity, and the alt-right, so men's rights activists, incels, these sort of groups. And one thing that's always so hard is to contextualize those really negative patriarchal elements of society while still trying to focus on the resistance side of it. And one thing I really enjoyed about the film was how you explored so many facets of women's experiences with their bodies and pleasure under patriarchy, while consistently centering their experiences, the experiences of women, of queer folks, the focus staying on those subjects rather than, too much screen time to those negative forces that they are trying to resist. So that's just something I sort of took from it. I guess tell me about kind of structuring that and how you work to keep the focus.
Well, I wanted, the film's an essay, right? And it's an essay that explores, what does it take for women to be treated equally as sexual beings, right? And what gets in the way. And so there are many things that get in the way, and they're very serious things, right? And they reside, as you mentioned earlier, in the institutions in our culture: academia, medicine, religion, government. They're there, right? These are not made up things. They're there. And the result of those things happening is sometimes often very horrible things, right? So women are still not paid equally. In the United States, we don't have an Equal Rights Amendment that's passed by law. So apparently we're not equal under the law. But I also wanted, I didn't want the film just to be about all of the negative stuff. I wanted to show how people are rising up against this and fighting it. And so when we get to Koriyama and queer culture, I offer that. I used to say I'm offering queer culture as an alternative narrative, right? And the alternative narrative is not to say, well, we should all be queer, but rather we should all embrace queer culture, because within queer culture it says people should be allowed to live and love in whatever way makes sense for them, period. And imagine if we could do that. Imagine if we weren't so terrified of somebody who was different from us, different from a heteronormative cisgendered man, right? Imagine if we could just all accept human beings for who they were and how they wanted to be in their bodies. I think we would change the world. And so I end, hopefully on an upbeat way, which is to say we can attain that. It's possible. All bodies are entitled to the pleasure they're capable of. That doesn't take pleasure away from anybody else. It just says this has happened evolutionarily in our bodies. We have an organ that's got one function, sexual pleasure. That wouldn't have happened if it wasn't supposed to be there. Because evolutionarily speaking, it would have like disappeared, right? If it wasn't used, it would have disappeared. So I wanted the film to end on an empowered note, and one that says, we can make a change in the world. We can, and we desperately need to now. So.
Well, that definitely leads to the next thing I wanted to mention, which is Sophia Wallace's statement that I had to write out. I loved it. To me, the clit is a symbol that's queer, and it's also a symbol that's open to anybody. It expresses our human capacity for joy, for creativity, for philosophy, for connection, and yes, joyful sexuality. I just thought that was such a great statement, and it really resonated with me, showing that the sort of the symbolism here, it does go beyond literal anatomy and biology. And I was really inspired by this idea of the clitoris as having the potential to be inclusive, intersectional, a queer symbol. It just kind of shows how powerful it is as a symbol, and why cliteracy is a movement that is happening in all these different ways and needs to happen. Just wondering if you could tell me your thoughts on that.
Well, it was sort of interesting because when I started making the film, the clitoris was an organ, right, on the body of every mammal-born female, and it was also something that made people uncomfortable. And as I continued making the film, the clitoris itself had a little narrative arc where it became less about an organ and more about a metaphor for inclusion and the acceptance of all bodies and all of the joyful things that Sophia Wallace talks about. And that's really the way I look at it now, as this is, yes, it's an organ on your body if you're born female, but it's also a metaphor for all of the things that we could achieve and that we do in life that are good and kind and wonderful and joyful. And that's one way I'd rather have women look at it than be ashamed of it, right? Look at this organ as this metaphor for all of these wonderful things, a coming together of people fighting against racism and misogyny and, you know, sexism and all of the things that hold people down, right? That's not what the clit's about. The clit's about, you know, inclusion and the joy that we all have, the capacity for joy that we all have in our lives.
The film also caused me to think a lot about how this whole conversation intersects with something that's a big, prevalent issue today, being capitalism, and where it is bringing our planet and our society, certainly where it is bringing our gender politics. It is so interwoven. I think we need to look at, you know, capitalism when we look at any of this stuff. Certainly one of your subjects, Jasmine, really brought that lens into some of her conversation, talking about how we're told that our sexuality is bad while simultaneously watching our sexuality used to sell everything under the sun, you know, but so to commodify yourself being that act of resistance. That was really interesting to me. I guess, what did you come across while doing the film about the intersection of capitalism as it relates to this uncliterate world?
Well, if I were a better scholar, I could answer this better, but capitalism counts on the fact that women take a traditional role in the family, right? That the family structure is very important to the capitalist structure because, you know, you have a family and the family's a man and a woman and two kids, and the woman she may work outside the home, but she also does all this work in the home, right? That she's not paid for. And then the man goes out and makes a lot of money. Now, women go out and make a lot of money as well, but that family structure is important to the perpetuation of capitalism. And so when you have cultures, queer cultures or gay people coming together and having kids and everybody disrupting that whole system, that's very frightening to a patriarchal capitalistic society because it goes against what we think we need that has to be in place, right? And if I were an economic scholar or a public policy scholar, I would be better equipped to talk about this, but that's not true, right? I mean, I don't think that capitalism can only work one way. I think there's possibly a way of making capitalism work for a whole lot of other people in a much better way than it currently does now. Because right now it just works for the top, and everybody on the bottom kind of gets nothing. And so I do think I think it's a part of it. I think it's the status quo is what everybody wants to maintain, right? Because nobody wants to give up any little power. It's too frightening. But the status quo isn't working so well right now, right? That's why people are in the streets protesting, and people don't have jobs, and people don't have food, and it's not working right now. And so it's time for a change. And I really, and I'm encouraged seeing all of the young people calling for that change. That's what's been very uplifting.
Yeah, there definitely feels like there's a slow shift coming where we're not seeing capitalism as innate to society anymore, or something that's just brought down from on high. We realize it's man-made. We realize it's patriarchally made and enforced.
And we don't have to have an economic structure which is at the expense of everything, at the expense of our environment, at the expense of people who work in minimum wage jobs. We can have a different structure in which people partake and all participate in a more equal way. Again, I'm not an expert in this, but I have to believe that's possible.
Me too. I also have to believe it's possible. We spoke a little bit about this already, but I noted how, the conversation inevitably and rightfully turned to, looking at and how those things sort of factor in with all this. And one interviewee spoke about how women's sexuality is seen as sort of an uprising that can be perceived again as a threat to this toxic or fragile masculinity. And other subjects spoke about how violence is a mechanism of keeping women in their place. Koriyama specifically spoke about rape as this mechanism of colonization and racism. I guess, tell me more about what you learned about sexual violence and rape culture specifically through doing this film.
Well, I wouldn't say I learned about it specifically through doing this film, because I certainly am very aware of it. It's rape culture is just a part of the reality that women have to live their lives with, and it's often a reality that is ignored. And so, we don't often talk about what happens in wars, right? Well, men die in wars, and we put monuments up to them when they die, and that's good. But women also suffer during war. They are frequently the victims of horrible rape by opposing forces, and they don't even have to be big wars. They can be small wars all across the world, and that acceptance that this is just the way it is for women is deeply disturbing, because it continues even in this culture in the United States, right? I mean, it's just I think it's a part of the misogynistic culture that grows up, that is, created and perpetrated around women, that we are somehow deserving of being punished for causing this behavior in men, because we're so arousing that they can't control themselves, and that it's a violent act to control another person's body. It's a powerful act to control another person's body. And so that I've always been aware of that, and it was eloquently spoken about several times by several of the people in the film. And wouldn't it be great if we all lived in a culturally cliterate world and rape became something that people didn't even know what it meant anymore? You had to explain to them that it was something that happened a long time ago, but it doesn't happen anymore. Wouldn't that be great?
One of my favorite takeaways just from the film is the subject Koriyama saying, "I think pleasure is a form of resistance." And that's sort of the hopeful message that it imbued with me as a viewer, as a person who this really does speak to. And it seems like many of the subjects that you featured in the film have come to develop this cliteracy in different ways, in art, in how we, invent and actually create sex toys. like completely changing that to actually make it correct for the audience that it's intended for, to take it outside this sort of superfluous or novelty zone into something that's actually going to help people. There's just so many different ways in which, you know, cliteracy, I think, can be promoted and practiced and embodied. I guess after all this, all the research and all the different explorations that you did your understanding of what it means to be cliterate or have cliteracy evolve? And if so, what does it mean to you now after years of doing this project?
Well, when I first started the project, I probably didn't use the word clitoris in a complete sentence ever, right? I probably didn't use the word ever. And when I met Sophia Wallace, and I was in my 50s, that was the first time she showed me what the internal clitoris looked like. So that was the first time I saw what a clitoris looked like. And I was pretty old. And I remember thinking, being very sad that I hadn't taught my daughter about that, right? That I'm a pretty with it woman and a feminist, and yet I hadn't told her about her own body. And so I, in making this film, became kind of a warrior for the clit. And I talk about it easily and openly, and I talk to my kids about it, and I do it without a filter. And if somebody asks me what kind of film I'm making, I usually say, I'm going to answer you. And when I do, please remember you asked, because I'm not embarrassed to talk about it. And so, and I don't think anybody should be embarrassed to talk about it, right? Male sexual pleasure is written about constantly. I always say Philip Roth almost won a Nobel Prize for doing nothing but writing about the pursuit of male pleasure at the expense of the women he was pursuing. But that was great literature. So I think women should step up their conversations around the clitoris. They should step up their conversations around their own pleasure and what they deserve, and how they can learn about and understand their bodies, because then they can share that knowledge with their partners, whoever they are. And I really feel that for women, this is a path to equality. You can't, if your pleasure in bed isn't equal, then you can't be equal in life, because it translates into every other facet of your life, whether it's in a classroom or a boardroom or in a religious institution or an academia. If you cannot speak up in bed, you cannot speak up in life. That's a way of silencing women's voices. And so I hope the film begins a conversation and it gives people language to talk about this in a way that makes them comfortable and makes them feel safe. Because I think Sophia Wallace said it best: pleasure begins in safety. We cannot have pleasure unless we feel safe in our bodies.
And for everyone to know that they're not alone in this, that there is this collective sense that this is something that we'll all benefit from as we slowly resist this erasure and this, treating women's sexual pleasure as a novelty, as a threat, as something to be repressed and sidelined. There is, this community in which it will make gains in so many different ways. But the first step is actually naming it, being able to say it, talking about it, teaching children, letting them know.
It should be taught about it. Little girls know about boys' penises when they're little. If a little girl's got a brother in the house, she knows all about it. So why wouldn't he know about her clitoris? And that's, you normalize it. You have to normalize the language. Imagine if we didn't teach boys about their penis in sex education. That's absurd, right? But that's what happens to girls in sex education. They leave out the organ that is most vital to their pleasure.
So what do you hope, where do you hope this film will go in terms of, wide audience, used in schools?
Yeah, I hope I can get this film in front of as many people as possible. I've found that the audience is people from the age of 16 to 80 and every gender variation. And people are hungry for the information in this film. I would also be really happy if there came a time when every young woman entering her freshman year of high school knew what her clitoris looked like, where it was, and what it was for. I would consider myself successful the day that happens.
Amazing. I hope it does. Maria, is there anything else you want to add just before we wrap up? I'll let people know how to see the film.
No, just thank you very much for showcasing our film. We're really honored to be a part of the festival. And, you know, for information on the film, go to our website, dilemmaofdesiredoc.com. And please, you know, get Clitoris. It helps all of us.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Maria, so much for this conversation and for sharing your insights with the St. John's International Women's Film Festival community. And thank you for making this important and illuminating film. I've watched it twice so far, and I definitely plan to watch it again. The Dilemma of Desire by Maria Finitzo is screening as part of the St. John's International Women's Film Festival, October 14th to 18th. And you can learn more at the website at www.womensfilmfestival.com. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.